Good afternoon. I want to thank everybody for coming in this afternoon out of such a glorious, one more glorious fall day here in New England. And welcome to the Newhouse Distinguished Writer Series. We're in our 5th year now and going strong, a great series that brings writers from all over the world into the Newhouse for an afternoon of reading and writing and talking and great conversations. So our reading this afternoon is by Siddhartha Deb, and our host for the reading is Nikhil Rao, who's a member of the history department here at Wellesley College, and also an active member of the Newhouse Advisory Board. Nikhil's own research interests focus on transformations in urban society in 20th century South Asia. His book, House But No Garden, Apartment Living in Bombay Suburbs, 1898 to 1964, was published by University of Minnesota Press in 2013. And his current work is looking at the formation of suburbs and the suburban communities in late colonial Bombay. So I think Nikhil will be a great interlocutor for this afternoon's reading, and I'm really grateful that he's agreed to help us out this afternoon. So can I ask you before we get going to turn off any phones or other noise-making devices? And the format will be that Siddhartha Deb will read for a bit, and then he and Nikhil will have a conversation up here, which we will then open up to you in the audience, and then we'll have books available to be signed after the reading. So thank you very much, and Nikhil.
Okay, thank you, Carol, for the introduction. Thank you for this opportunity to participate in this reading. So Siddhartha Deb is Associate Professor at the Eugene Lang College for the Liberal Arts at the New School in New York City. He, in addition to his most recent book, The Beautiful and the Damned, A Portrait of the New India, which was published in 2011 by Faber and Faber, and which was a finalist for the Orwell Prize, Siddhartha is also the author of 2 novels, The Point of No Return and An Outline of the Republic, both published by HarperCollins, 2003 and 2005. I thought there would be 2 things that would be sort of worth me speaking about to introduce Siddhartha. The first is just to say a little bit, for those of you who may not be familiar with this topic, but to say a little bit about the new India which Siddhartha is trying to portray in this book through his study of these sort of various actors. As some of you may know, but as many of you may not, India, for much of its post-colonial history, from 1947 until 1991, was in some way or another a sort of planned, centrally regulated economy. It was a place where, and this was the kind of India that Siddhartha grew up in, and it was actually also the India where I grew up in, where sort of consumer products, wealth, and so on and so forth were much less visible than they are now. In 1991, in response to various pressures, India embraced on a so-called liberalization and an opening of the economy to the world, as a result of which, well, many things happened, among which, however, are a very visible and very spectacular accumulation of wealth by some groups of the population. Right, so this is sort of one, I think, very important contextual point that I thought it would be worthwhile to foreground here. And this is the India that, especially in the 2000s, took on a very aggressive marketing campaign, selling itself as India Shining in advertising campaigns that one could see on the sides of buses in Germany, in the United States, and so on. Of course, many parts of India did not shine, right? And many parts of India, if anything, became a lot less shiny, became darker and murkier. And it's precisely, I think, this particular contrast that somehow has become much starker in the last 2 decades that Siddhartha's book tries to portray. A second point that I wanted to bring up, this is a biographical detail, but I'm going to say a little bit about it since it, I think, plays a very important role in Siddharth's writings in general and in this book in particular, which is that Siddhartha was born and raised in Shillong, which is in the northeastern state of Meghalaya. And now, Meghalaya is one of a cluster of states in the northeast of India that are only connected to India by a sort of narrow isthmus of land that runs between Bhutan in the north and Bangladesh in the south. This physical separation from mainstream India is reflected also in an often troubled relationship that this entire region has had with the Indian nation states. And this has been sort of, I think, this relationship has been troubled in at least two ways, right? One is the sort of recurring history of separatism and often violent insurgency movements in various parts of this northeastern sort of cluster of states, and the other, the violent sort of uprisings and insurgencies, and of course the equally, if not more violent, counterinsurgency actions that are undertaken by the state to sort of quell these movements, right? So that's one important sort of marginality that's worth mentioning. The other, of course, on a more day-to-day level, is the kind of sense of otherness that I think, and that comes out in Siddharth's writings, affects people from these parts of India who come and try and make their way in the world in Delhi or in a factory town in Andhra Pradesh or in Bombay and so on and so forth, right? A kind of persistent sort of pattern of, at the least, a sort of negative stereotyping and more sort of direly an active pattern of discrimination that people from the Northeast experience. So I think this particular background really informs Siddharth's perspective on India and I think is worth mentioning. And I think also accords his work and his writing a kind of very, in my view, in the context of works that have appeared recently on India, of a unique and angular perspective on the new India. So without any further delay, let me please welcome Siddhartha, who's going to read from his most recent book, The Beautiful and the Damned, A Portrait of the New India.
Thank you, Nikhil. Thank you, Carol. Can everybody hear me? Good. That's a very nice introduction, and I hope in our conversation we'll touch upon all these things, the new India, the India shining, as well as the northeastern part of the region of the country that I sort of come from and that I sort of keep going back to in my writing. Sometimes deliberately, sometimes not deliberately, and yet, in fact, the new book, the nonfiction book, wasn't supposed to be about the Northeast at all. It was supposed to be about the more visible, shining India. It was supposed to be about Delhi and Bangalore, and it is about all these places. But I remember being a particular moment in the book when I find myself ending up writing about the Northeast, and it sort of forces its way back in. And feeling both puzzled but also pleased about the process. But I think these things we'll touch on in the conversation with Nikhil, and I hope, in the question and answers. But just to be slightly contrarian, although in an unplanned way, the section I'm going to read from is actually not about the Northeast or it's actually about the very, very central part of India. And it's about the new India, but kind of in an angular way again, and I think that is a good word that Nikhil used. And it's basically about an Indian city called Bhopal. And it's from the introductory part of the book. And it's basically a story about, because my book, even the nonfiction book, it's about characters, it's about people. I'm trying to probe these questions about politics and economics and about societies, but very much by looking at people as characters, not so much as voices in the way I would as a journalist, but more as a fiction writer in trying to give them their own angularity in some sense. So this is about one of these characters, and it's in central India. I'll read for about maybe 20 minutes, and then we can have the question answers. In November 2004, I found myself in the city of Bhopal, pursuing a forgotten story. I was there to write a piece on the 20th anniversary of a disaster when a pesticide factory run by the American multinational Union Carbide spewed out toxic fumes and killed at least 3,000 people in 24 hours. In the 2 decades since then, the death toll had reached at least 20,000, while another 100,000 people were estimated by Amnesty International to be suffering chronic and debilitating illnesses caused by the lethal gas that had leaked out from the factory. When I arrived in Bhopal, I was told that I should meet a man called Abdul Jabbar. Even though no one outside the city had heard of him, I certainly hadn't. He had a reputation in Bhopal as someone who had done quite a bit to organize the victims of the disaster. He ran an organization for women widowed and rendered destitute by the disaster, working from a converted industrial shed in the old quarter of the city. It was a shoddily run place in many ways, with grimy toilets, battered sewing machines, a telephone kept, oddly enough, in the kitchen, photographs of Gandhi and lesser-known Indian radicals, an office overflowing with paper, and a veranda where a display case contained hideous stuffed toys that stared at visitors with glassy eyes. Jabbar, who ran this place, claimed to have no faith in the West. He detested multinationals, especially Dow Chemicals, which had since acquired Union Carbide. But he disliked organizations like Greenpeace, too, even though they had tried to draw attention to the conditions in Bhopal so many years after the disaster. He did not take money from Western outfits, a position that set him at odds with a vastly more efficient organization called the Bhopal Group for Information and Action. He did not have a website for his organization, although even the local reporters begged him to set one up. He claimed, when I was first introduced to him, that he didn't speak to Western reporters or to urban, upper-class Indians, which is what he took me to be. He refused to speak in English, even though he seemed to have a working knowledge of the language. For a soft-spoken man of benign, even nondescript appearance, short, pudgy, with a mustache and thick glasses, he was surprisingly truculent, and I came away from my initial meeting feeling rather disappointed. Nevertheless, one afternoon, I turned up to see the last 30 minutes of a regular weekly rally that he ran in a park across from the ladies' hospital. He was less rambling as a public speaker, focused but intimate with his audience. When he ended his speech, he didn't raise his voice in a shout, as Indian politicians tend to do. Instead, he said very softly, "Naya Zamana," the new age, a phrase that the women closed emphatically by loudly leaping to their feet and answering, "Aayega," will come. The slogan was repeated once more, "The new age will come," softer and on a downbeat, and even before the response had come from the women, Jabbar had moved away, coiling up the wire trailing from his microphone. Soon after, he came up to me and said that it was a good time to talk if I wanted to talk to him, but he first had to take care of a small task. I accompanied Jabbar across the street to the ladies' hospital. An ambulance packed with passengers stood in the driveway. I caught a glimpse of a woman in the back and what looked like a baby in swaddling clothes. "Go on to the house," Jabbar said. "Drive safely. I'll come later." Then we walked back to the park, where Jabbar wheeled his Honda scooter out and asked me to climb on. During our ride through the jagged, amorphous quarters of the old city, I discovered that the woman in the ambulance was Jabbar's wife, Yasmina, and that she had given birth to a boy the night before. The activist had become a father, a first in his life, a fact that in its intimacy and domesticity seemed a little incongruous with the utopian, large-scale issues that had been discussed in the park, but perhaps less incongruous than the fact that I, a stranger whom he didn't like, was being taken to Jabbar's house the same day his wife and infant son were coming home from the hospital. As Jabbar negotiated a path through the crowded marketplace, a furniture store caught his eye. He asked me to stay with the scooter while he went into the store, a room open to the street and packed with locally made furniture, most of it cobbled together out of plastic or cheap wood. What had attracted Jabbar's attention was an infant cradle of pink plastic with a mosquito net attached to it. Jabbar bargained briefly, bought the contraption, and handed it to me. The cradle had looked small in the store, but as I sat on the back seat of Jabbar's scooter, riding up narrow alleyways and under tiny bridges, it began to assume gargantuan proportions and seemed to be becoming larger. I had to shout at Jabbar to stop when I thought we were going to scrape against a wall, with frequent halts for me to dismount when we had to cross particularly narrow stretches. We finally arrived at his house. There I was introduced to Yasmina, a Kashmiri woman in her late 20s. She was dressed in a black hijab, her hair covered but her face unveiled, and she looked exhausted. I saw the baby and encountered a squadron of mosquitoes that made me thankful that the cradle had come with a net. Relatives and neighbors passed in and out so fluidly as to leave little distinction between outdoors and indoors, between sitting room and bedroom. I drank tea and talked to Jabbar's neighbors. They were working-class people who were proud of him, of the fact that he had become a father, of the trees he had got them to plant in the neighborhood, which was poor but wasn't squalid. Then it was time for Jabbar to head out again because he wanted me to meet people in the nearby slums. Jobars Work, which I eventually then had a chance to observe through many long mornings and many afternoons spent at his office, the flow of time punctuated by the cry of the muezzin from a nearby mosque, involved an unending set of challenges and rather small victories. His organization had filed a case in the Supreme Court asking the Indian government to distribute the full amount of compensation money that it had taken from Union Carbide. 2 decades after the event, the government had paid out no more than $80 to each person, and even that money had to be divided with corrupt lawyers and officials. People who came to Jabbar for help included those who weren't members of his organization, such as a middle-aged man who showed up one afternoon and began to cry with rage and frustration as he told us his story. He was a waiter in a tea shop and who had been affected by the gas. The government had finally released his initial payment to the lawyer that he had needed to hire to make his case for compensation. The lawyer invited the waiter into the chamber and asked him to take half the money and leave the rest as fees. When the waiter protested, saying that he had already paid the lawyer's fees, the lawyer called in a few men, thrashed the waiter, and threw him out. When the waiter tried to file a police report at the local station, the officer in charge laughed at him. Jabbar's forehead grew furrowed as he heard this story. He asked for the name of the lawyer. Then he called other lawyers to ask them what they thought of the man. When he had verified from a few different sources that the man was known to be both corrupt and violent, he asked the waiter for the name of the policeman who had refused to help him. Then he called a senior police officer and told him the story. He made an appointment for the waiter with the senior officer, hung up, and then asked someone in his office to talk the waiter through the procedure he would have to follow when he met the senior official. The whole process took about an hour, in which time Jabbar earned the waiter's gratitude, confirmed his reputation in the slums and tenements of Bhopal as an honest, pugnacious man, and achieved nothing in terms of furthering his organization's presence outside his city. It was very different from the way the Bhopal Group for Information and Action was run by Satyanath Sarangi. I had gone to visit Satyu, as Sarangi is known, a few days earlier. Satyu met me at the site where he was putting up a new building for his clinic, Sambhavna. It would serve as both headquarters for his organization and as an Ayurvedic clinic for gas victims. The new clinic was set back from the crowded roads and settlements of the old city. The red brick building, Satyu said, was planned to be ecologically sustainable. It would be kept cool by a complicated system of airflow and by water circulating around the walls. The garden, where we sat and talked, would be used to grow organic herbs. The patients, when the clinic was in operation, would receive Ayurvedic medicines and massages. It was as different from Jabbar's chaotic operation as Satyu was from Jabbar. Tall, bearded, Sporting a ponytail, he had the look of an aging rock singer. He wore a turban wrapped loosely around his head and a black shirt proclaiming Toulouse 27/9/2001, 2002, 2003, which he explained to me as commemorating a chemical plant explosion in Toulouse and where he had gone in 2003 to attend a conference. Satyu was handsome and articulate, alert to the ways of the world. And while Jabbar didn't like interacting with the West, Satyu thrived on it, even if his West was the alternative, countercultural West of green anti-globalization politics. I could see how much this interaction characterized Satyu's organization, from the Indian Americans and the Bard College undergraduates who sat around his office to the design and principles of his new clinic. So when Satyu said that Jabbar was inefficient and outdated, it was hard to dismiss his charges. They had been colleagues once in the immediate aftermath of the disaster. At that time, when the Union Carbide swiftly dissociated itself from the local factory, initially refusing to even reveal the composition of the gas, claiming because it was a proprietary formula, and when senior Indian politicians and officials fled the city in private aircrafts, a large number of disparate personalities, left-leaning political parties, and groups had come together under a loose coalition called Morcha, or Forum. But Morcha splintered a few years after the event, when the pressures of the original disaster was no longer available, and Jabbar and Satyu had gone their very different ways. Satyu had a terrific website where information and reports were collated and organized neatly. But what he didn't have were the working class women, slum dwellers, the toothless old men one encountered constantly in Jabbar's office. At the premises of Satyu's office, the gas victims seemed to appear only on the posters on the walls. I found this paradox fascinating, especially in the new India, a place supposed to have become exposed to the world, or in other words, the West, through globalization. So when I met Jabbar, I pushed him, saying that I could understand why he didn't like Western corporations, but I wanted to know what he had against Greenpeace, against Western NGOs trying to help the people he cared about. Jabbar began to talk about the arrogance of showing up among impoverished people with laptops and digital cameras. They fly in for a few days, he said, and I knew the verb fly was as important here as the phrase few days. When Jabbar went to Delhi, he didn't even buy a ticket for a reserved berth, let alone an air-conditioned coach. He traveled in a general compartment with no assigned seating and no limit to the number of people who could get on, a free-for-all realm where every inch of space is claimed by some part of a human body. They stay in that fancy hotel, Lakeview, Jabbar said, where it's 5,000 rupees a night. It's not, I told him. It's less than half the amount. But I was relieved I wasn't staying there. I knew that Jabbar approved of the fact that I was staying at the more down-market Indian coffee house hotel. Jabbar was undeterred by my correction of the room rates. It's still half a month's wages for people here. How will poor people even talk to someone living there in what looks like luxury, let alone march with them? We were talking in Jabbar's office, and he led me up to a photograph that showed a young man with thick glasses and an almost emaciated body. The man was Shankar Guha Niyogi, an activist who had tried to organize mill workers in the neighboring state of Chhattisgarh through the 80s and the 90s. The workers had been mostly tribal people living in tenements and kept in virtual bondage to mill owners and moneylenders. When Niyogi came to Bhopal, Jabbar said, he asked me to take him to a market to buy a frock for his daughter. By a frock, he means a dress, in case it might seem an unfamiliar word. He kept pushing away everything I showed him, saying he wanted something cheaper. Eventually, I got frustrated, and I asked him what his problem was. We were in an ordinary bazaar, after all, and the frocks were fairly cheap. And what Niyogi told me was, Jabbar, the people I organize wouldn't be able to afford these for their daughters. If my daughter, who plays with their children, is seen wearing far better clothes, how will they take me seriously? Niyogi was killed in the early 90s by thugs hired by the mill owners, although his wife stayed on and continues to organize them. In the late 80s, Jabbar himself had come close to being killed when buying vegetables in the market one day. He was shot in the stomach by a man working for a slum landlord, angered by Jabbar's advocacy on behalf of the tenants. The shooter was relatively inexperienced, so even though he got close to Jabbar, his aim faltered at the last minute. But apart from that single dramatic incident, Jabbar's worries seemed to be mostly about prosaic things. He had a weak heart, and our conversations included breaks for the many pills he had to swallow. His organization operated on very little money, and although Satyu, in a moment of criticism, had talked of Jabbar amassing money, I had seen no such signs of wealth on him, either at work or at home. One morning, Jabbar came to the hotel where I was staying. There was a coffee shop on the ground floor that was a popular meeting place for the local journalists. They gathered there every morning for a couple of hours, exchanging notes before heading out to their newspaper offices or to their reporting beats. Jabbar hoped to meet the journalists and hand out press releases about the compensation case coming up in the Supreme Court. He was popular with most of the local reporters, but his arrival that morning was upstaged by the appearance of a former chief minister, a Congress politician. A smooth, fair-skinned man with gold-framed glasses and big teeth, the politician entered the coffee house with followers and a television crew in tow. The reporters, most of whom I'd got to know and thought of as fairly committed journalists, were suddenly transformed, laughing at every joke the politician made, hanging on to every statement of his, even though he began with the announcement that he had come not for a press conference, but for an intellectual exchange. When Jabbar approached our table, the politician greeted him affably, but none of the reporters had time for the badly typed press releases Jabbar had brought with him. It was like watching a force field of power, distorting everything within its range, twisting the faces of the reporters. Jabbar sat in the shadows, towards the back, waiting for an opportune moment to hand out his press releases. It didn't come. Instead, one of the politician's followers, a man with ostentatious caste marks on his forehead, whispered that it was his birthday. The politician laughed with delight. "We must celebrate," he said, rubbing his hands together. He took out some moisturizing lotion and then spread it on his hands. Another minion stepped forward and announced that it was his birthday as well. "Even better," the politician said. He snapped his fingers. "Waiter, come here. Order birthday cakes from the pastry shop in the market." One of the reporters leaned forward and informed the politician that the birthday boys were vegetarians and that cakes would contain eggs as an ingredient. There was a moment of silence, and then the politician said, "Eggless cakes then." And the phrase ran like a refrain to the mouths of reporters and photographers, minions and waiters, the phrase eggless cakes, as if the man had turned into Solomon solving in an instant the most fiendish of paradoxes. Jabbar and I walked out just as the pink, eggless cakes arrived, borne high in the air by turbaned waiters, escorted to the table by a couple of the politician's armed security guards. Outside, in the lunchtime chaos of rickshaws, scooters, and cars, I remarked to Jabbar that his venture to the hotel had been in vain. "I'll come back tomorrow," he said. "Eventually, they will look at the press releases, and they will write about them. The politician will be gone in an hour, but I will always be around." Stop there.
Passage, and I thought, there were so many wonderful things that I liked about that, from the image of you sort of holding this cradle on the back of Jabbar's scooter, maneuvering through the narrow sort of alleys of Bhopal, to the really wonderfully detailed account you give of what exactly Jabbar did and continues to do perhaps for the people who come to him, right? This account of what he did for the waiter who was sort of bashed up by, the lawyers, thugs or whatever. And you sort of provide a kind of very detailed account, which I think raises a question that I'll lead off with, which is, what in your view, what is Indian democracy, or what is the status of Indian democracy? Because this is something we hear about a lot, the world's largest democracy, and it is a nation that votes a lot. and will be going to the polls next year. And I mean, it is in some ways a remarkable thing that it is, despite this history of poverty and this extremely staggering heterogeneity, that it is a democracy, right? But at the same time, what kind of recourse do non-elites have, right? And this, you gave one account of what had to be done to procure some kind of redress, right? But it raises a larger question, right? I guess, which is, what is the status, in your view, of the democratic process?
Well, I think it's changed a lot. We have to understand that it's not a static process. I mean, I think it's not, and it's not even something particular to India. I think the going-ons in America currently tell you that, it is not a static thing. These things are, open to pressures of various, susceptible to pressures of various kinds. And you can't look at democracy or voting in isolation from other things. I mean, if you look at, if you look at the statistics, something like 30% of the Indian Parliament are basically people whose fathers. It's extremely gender specific, and it's extremely caste specific, and it's extremely region specific. But if you look at the statistics, I think the recent ones are something like 30% are essentially hereditary. They are basically people whose fathers, or in some case their mothers, have had a parliamentary post before. That's 1/3. And if you look at the Indian democracy, and if you look at the Congress party and the big contending, the parties are the sort of, the equivalent to the Republicans, the Democrats here are the Congress party, which is seen as liberal in certain cultural, religious questions. In terms of the marketplace, they're both fairly, neoliberal in their politics. But the Congress is seen as a little bit more open, a little bit more, secular. That's the word that they use for themselves, as opposed to the BJP, which is much more a Hindu, majoritarian, upper caste, right-wing party, basically. But the argument that you see that in terms of the hereditary politics is that, you see that in the Congress party, the legacy of the Gandhi family, that, are we going to have another prime minister? Is it going to be Rahul Gandhi, who comes from this long, if you look at that family, they're older in their presence as a political power than post-colonial India. Yeah. They go back to colonial India. But the thing is that, against this, you have, say, the other contending, the BJP, the Gujarat Chief Minister Narendra Modi, and his argument that he's a self-made man, unlike the Gandhis. And in some ways, he is a self-made man, in the sense that he's risen to the organizations of this extremely parochial sectarian party. He's a man who's extremely pro-business, pro-upper caste. Under him in Gujarat in 2002, there were these massive riots, which led to targeted Muslims, these cases are ongoing, but it happened under his watch. There are people who have claimed that he is directly involved in it, and he was embarrassing enough even to the George Bush administration for him to be denied a visa in 2005, which is fascinating. Just to bring it, I like to bring the conversation, just to give you some reference point. Even the Bush administration found Modi embarrassing enough to actually deny him a visa, although he was invited to England recently to address a very large conference of, essentially businessmen, because people look at it as investment. So to turn back to the question of democracy, I think on paper it does look fantastic, because the Indian government is good at doing certain things. Like, it's actually good at distributing ballot boxes into all, and the television cameras love to do this. But the ballot boxes and putting a slip of paper in itself is not enough. It's about access to power. And Jabbar, in some sense, what is ironic about him is that he actually represents a kind of old mode of organizing. And that's one of the paradoxes that I was trying to follow. The idea about New India, when I began reporting this book, that India is being changed completely by information technology. This is the argument that was being made again and again by countless articles, countless books, all the way from Tom Friedman. This is the New India. And my argument is that in terms of power, actually the New India is still the old India. The new, this is what I mean. I don't think, these were the arguments that were being made, that now we'll have a real democracy because everybody has a cell phone. And I actually very much question this in my book. So Jobars' mode of organizing, I mean, is a very. I want to say there is something quite Indian about it, and there is this mode of resistance, which I think is also very true of the subcontinent and the people. But that's not easily translatable to the ballot boxes and the parliamentary parties.
Absolutely, and I think that really came out, just again in that account. What's so illustrative is, that waiter, he first goes through the institutional channels, right? He goes to the police officer who laughs at him, and then that doesn't work. So this whole other sort of mechanism of redress has to be resorted to. That entails, Jabar making some phone calls, calling like a bigger police officer to sort of chastise the guy who did it. And I think that comes out really well, that there's this talk of radical change and so on, but in many ways, the institutions, the mechanisms through which things get done may not be that different, right? That said, one of the sort of very compelling tensions in this book is, the one between a very palpable sort of and really intense kind of aspiration, right? That, you see, for instance, I mean, in many parts of your book, but, in the kind of students who go and study at Arundam Chowdhury's Indian Institute of, this is a sort of a new business school that has perhaps not, a bit questionable in its antecedents and in its methods, but just the energy that is detectable. And, to some extent, his Arundam Chowdhury's, as you describe in your book, very justifiable claim that, look, I educate this many thousand people a year, right? Whereas the famous Indian Institutes of Management are state subsidized, they educate a few hundred a year, and those people then go off and work overseas somewhere, right? So on the one hand, you have this intense aspiration that's perhaps made possible by the changes of the last 2 decades, or at least sort of accentuated. On the other hand, you have the persistence, if not the actual worsening of the practices of discrimination and violence based on caste or religion or gender sort of categories, right? So I guess my question to you is this: in your view, what are the possibilities, or have the possibilities for young people, going out into the world in India today? I mean, in your view, in the new India, are they? If you had to offer an assessment, what would you say?
Well, I like to look at it through specific lenses, but if I look at Arundam Chowdhury's Institute, and I call him a Gatsby figure. That was so. It's dramatic in the same way, from rags to riches, and you see this it's not particular to India. You see it in China. You see it in many of the so-called BRICS economies. These new flamboyant sort of self-made types. But I like to put the self-made within quotes, because nobody's really self-made. Nowhere. Not even the original Gatsby. Nobody's really self-made. But it's a wonderful myth, which is not to deny the kind of energy that Arundam Chowdhury has, the flamboyance or the intelligence. What is interesting, though, of course, is the book doesn't have that chapter in the Indian edition because he had it stopped by the courts. And in fact, he was on television recently in February demanding that I be arrested. Not demanding, he said he would have me arrested. It's quite interesting. But I think. Yes, there's a kind of energy an aspiration there was among the middle class, which is to say it's a significant number of people, because India is a huge country, it's a huge population, so it's a very, very significant. These are people among whom I would place myself. I belong to that category. My family is very much essentially urban. You've had some kind of English education, you've had some kind of, your family's had some kind of stability. There's often, you're often upper or middle caste, basically, in your dimensions. You have this urbanization. You've made the transition to modernity. Now you have to work hard. But, once you've got all these tools, and I push it back to myself. I mean, how did I get all this education? I mean, my grandparents were peasants. My father was a refugee from the partition. education, But my father had a government job. It was not because of some corporate social responsibility scheme. My father had a government job that had this that was problematic, didn't pay much, but that allowed this kind of enormous stability within, for a good section of our life. This is given the partition, this is given the violence, this is given the fact that we actually lost everything, that we were refugees, we started from zero. There was this enormous stability, and I had these other privileges which I can't just ignore. I was a boy. That was a very big part of it. I was much more privileged than my sister, even though my sister had a very good education too. But I was much more privileged in terms of the choices that I was allowed to make. So I think these aspirants that we are talking about, the kind of people, say, that Tom Friedman used to rave about, that has to be understood in this context. They didn't come out of nowhere. I was subsidized by the Indian government. My education was subsidized by the Indian government. I never paid anything more than 20 rupees a month, which is like, 40 cents entire all the way up to masters. And that's not to be, that is not something that you can dismiss. What happened post-91, and that basically the Indian elite started saying, we should do away with these kind of subsidies because they are not meritocratic. None of us, I did not make it because just out of sheer merit. I was also made by a social system. And so, that's one of the things that happened with the new energies is that there was a kind of a rupture created between the elites, and that's the top 150, 200 million in the country. And they vary widely all the way to the enormous super rich, the 60 plus billionaires, all the way down to somebody who's actually making just a middle class salary and who needs to keep working every month. So that's a very big band. But beneath them, we are talking about a country where, let's say, I don't like to use figures too much, because again, figures have been disputed hugely, in India. Yeah. But if you look at just children under the age of 5 suffering from malnutrition, that's the biggest number is in India. It's bigger than sub-Saharan Africa. It was 44% in the early 90s. After 20 years of growth, it's 43%. In terms of if you look at other things, if you've seen the one of the new interesting things is the Amartya Sen piece in the New York Review of Books about women in India, which I have significant. I think he's too kind to us, to Indians. I am much harder than this. But if you look at the map of the male-female birth ratios, they don't actually map the poor. It's like the wealthier states are precisely the ones where there's a declining ratio of female births. Yeah. And the poorer states or the less developed states are precisely where it's higher. And that is, again, interesting to look at. So, but if you look at India, beneath the sort of the top 100, 200 million that we've been talking about, and for the last 20 years, the discourse has become entirely that it's about them. I don't want to dismiss the energy they have or the hard work, but it's built on a larger social system. And one of the things that's happened, I think, in India is that even the middle class, until I would say the late 80s, was aware that they were connected to the majority, the poor. Whether they liked it or not, they knew they were connected. Now in the new dispensation, there's a real mental break between, and you can see this in even some of the language that comes up. There's a new op-ed piece again to do with masculinity, and it uses the phrase feral men. There's a certain language, a very new. And maybe in a way it's good. It's good to be honest, to say we really dislike the unwashed masses. Yeah. But there's a real break that has happened between the so-called masses. And there, it's really an incredible amount of turmoil, which connects us back to the rural India. Rural India is 400 million people, roughly 400 million people depend on agriculture for a living. Yeah. If you look at like the Indian Labour Organization statistics for, what kind of jobs are available for women, for instance. I was very interested in this when I was working on the chapter on waitresses, because you see many waitresses. This is a new category in India. You didn't see, growing up, it was a job that was traditionally done by lower class men. But now in the new India, that these opportunities have come up. So I'm not going to dismiss them right off, but I spent a great deal of time with a waitress in the book trying to figure out what it means, this new opportunity. But if you look at the statistics, the largest category after agriculture, the next category for women is construction work. It's the same as men. And then below that, the next category, and this is very gender specific, is maid servants. So India is an absurd place in many ways. And that's, I think, what I've been constantly trying to engage with.
Yeah.
And I think the new India is a lie in many ways, because it's really a much more complicated, absurd place. Yes, there's a huge amount of flamboyance and energy at the top, but it's begun to wear off a little bit, actually, post 2008, the financial crash. That even in India, even among the new rich, there is more. It's not quite the way it was in its heyday.
Right. No, absolutely. I mean, it's very palpable that India is, less shiny now than it was 10 years ago. And just to sort of elaborate on the op-ed piece that you mentioned by Lavanya Shankar, I believe.
Yes, I don't know her.
This was a piece that addressed the problem of anyway, it addressed the kind of recent hubbub around sort of Indian men and their sort of predatory nature, and it was sparked by a horrific gang rape of a woman in Delhi. Some of you would have heard of it. What was sort of striking about this op-ed was, of course, the distinction she makes between good Indian men and bad Indian men. Mm-hmm. The bad Indian men being part of this feral, I believe is the adjective she uses, feral sort of population of, people from the villages, right, who've somehow come to the cities and, are sort of unleashed there. And it's interesting, I was thinking actually of your book when I read that op-ed piece, because of course a large part of your book is, or a good part of your book is sort of talking to some of these migrant workers who have come from, villages or small towns and trying to find work, right?
Yes.
And what was really striking is, of course, you portray one such predator who is precisely not from that background, right, and who is from he's a successful executive and so on. So I was thinking about how this was, in a sense, a direct retort to this strain of public conversation.
Right.
Yeah.
Well, I mean, I think when this thing happened in December, it was, in a sense, I think it's fantastic that people went out on the streets to protest this gruesome thing. The Guardian did a wonderful report that had a map of the predators and the woman and her boyfriend. She got picked up at a bus stop where I used to live, in Munirka, which is this sort of a kind of a village within a very, very wealthy South Delhi, but it's kind of close to the university, so it's kind of because it's a village, it's kind of unpaved. It's cheaper. So even though it's geographically located in South Delhi, you can afford to live there. So, I lived there as a journalist, not very well paid journalist. A lot of students live there. And you get these there are a lot of people from the Northeast, and in fact, Munirka is mentioned in the book, because not only did I live there, but one of the waitress Esther, one of Esther's friends lives there, so I go back to this old neighborhood to actually, and there was this enormous sort of threat of violence against women. And one of the things that was happening was that, again, a very small segment of women have benefited from these service jobs that have come up, but which are enormously exploitative in their own terms.
Yeah.
But then you have these, India is complicated. So, you have local men who seem themselves, hierarchically superior actually to the women, A, because of gender, but B, also because of caste and ethnicity, and this comes out. But then they see also women having these jobs, which they can't have. So it creates this incredible dynamics. And, the thing is that the Indian media or the Indian government doesn't want to talk about these things, so the Indian corporations don't want to talk about these things. If you look at the way the recruitment patterns go, and again, I did some of this in terms of kind of an immersion reporting. Like one of the things that I did was, and partly this book began as a project that came off that, is that when the Guardian asked me to work at a call center, this was in 2004, so almost 10 years ago, because the call centers were these incredible sort of, new Indian jobs for young Indian people. And they were essentially hiring young Indians who were coming from far away, including from the Northeast.
Now, one of the things is once I applied for a job, I would have this recruiter calling me on my cell phone every day, asking me how many more boys and girls I could bring in from Shillong because they speak good English. But she would say, but the problem is you guys don't want to stay for more than a few months. And I was pretending to be this person who was still from Shillong. I said, this place is lousy. Why would we want to be here? It's actually, it's really much nicer back home, actually, you know. This is a hard place to be in. So, you know, there was this, so it's a very complex place. So in terms of the protests that happened in Delhi, people were very, very agitated because it was brutal. And the Indian government, of course, responded with, you know, the police with baton charges and tear gas. And I think the most horrible moment was when this girl was airlifted out of the Delhi hospital to Singapore. And this superpower that says it doesn't actually have the technology, and you know, she died in Singapore. But I think it was more like a cynical calculation. But you know, I think the problem is, and there are many problems, one of the things is we have to talk about Indian masculinity. And Indian masculinity is problematic not just because tradition. There is the whole New India argument, that the new Indians are completely free of the old biases. But it's not as simple as that. Tradition isn't always bad. Tradition also has, you know, within itself actually emancipatory radical potentials. If you know, in South Asian history, this has been true throughout. And modernity is not this sort of, this blessing without any kind of complications. It is true that you have huge number of urban migrant laborers, workers, who are just being exploited. And this is true for both the men and the women who are just cycled through. It is also true that agriculture in India is an enormous crisis because in the last 20 years, it has been completely stripped of state, any kind of subsidies, and it has been opened up to the market. And the other thing is, India is also environmentally a huge disaster, partly because of the kind of breakneck, very, very crony capitalist development it has done. And it's within this that this kind of violence is becoming more common. But we don't hear about the rural violence. For instance, there's been incredible violence. There's incredible violence against Dalit women, for instance. Or when I talked about 2002 and Mr. Modi being invited to talk in UK among the entrepreneurs, there was enormous violence against Muslim women in Gujarat in 2002. And that's the urban middle class likes to keep quiet about the kind of violence against women. For instance, the armed forces, to come back to the northeast, Manipur or Kashmir, where I was in July. There is I spent a great deal of time reporting in Kashmir, and I was in Shopian, where 2 women had drowned and who had been raped and murdered, the people believe. But you know, in Kashmir, the army is not susceptible to civil courts. It is, you know, it's under the Armed Forces Special Powers of Act, as it is in Manipur. There's enormous violence that happens in Manipur, in Kashmir, in central India against the indigenous populations. That's perpetrated by the police, paramilitary forces, army, and the urban middle class likes to keep quiet about it. So, you know, I think it's important to bring these things into the conversation and to complicate, the urban middle class's outrage, justifiable outrage, anger, but it's limited. It needs to be widened.
Okay. I have one more question, I guess, to just sort of bring it back to my introduction and bring it back to the Northeast, which is, again, as I said, an area that has been, well, it's geographically sort of distant and also has played a sort of troubled and as part of the idea of India, right? So I guess I have a very general question. I mean, what is the position of the northeastern states in the new India? I mean, in your view, just a few thoughts about. I just remember when I was growing up, it was, you couldn't go there, or you needed, even if you're an Indian, you needed to go to some parts, you needed sort of specific kinds of documents to go because there was, some parts were.
That's still true, yeah. The inner line permit.
Right.
Yeah, which is a colonial legislation, like almost all of these legislations are.
Right.
Yeah.
Right. So yeah, I guess my question is, what is the position in your view, of the Northeast in the new India?
Well, I mean, I write a little bit about it in the book, in the sense that the main character in the last chapter is this young waitress who's from the Northeast, and the name is Esther. That's not her real name. I changed her name at her request, and within the sort of metropolitan urban, it's complicated. On the one hand, they often speak English. They often They're often lighter skinned, so that goes down very well with the sort of the Indian sort of hierarchy, the internal hierarchy. At the same time, they're also, from the Northeast, and they are seen as Mongoloid people, and that's sort of down on the hierarchy. So, it's this complicated mix.
Yeah.
They're women. That's also down on the hierarchy. So all these things have to be taken into account. They're not seen in any kind of complexity. It's almost, I want to say, it's a kind of a colonial. I mean, sometimes I find that the Indians think about, or I want to qualify the phrase Indian. The Indian elites think about the Northeasterners, or in the same way as the colonial hierarchies were true in the way the British thought about the Indians. And they are seen as distant and as a kind of a service class, and the Northeasters are seen as a kind of an exotic travel place. It's associated in the mind very simply with music. And in fact, I have a very specific story about this. In Delhi, I was spending a great deal of time in Delhi when I was working on the book. I would get these very young, hip, young Delhi, college journalists, basically just out of college, very, very hip, that, they would keep asking me whether I knew somebody from Shillong called Lu Majao. And, they said it in a particular way that I couldn't quite catch the name. And I would often say, this is like, I was trying to interview somebody in some, some of them were quite sweet. I knew them. They would come and say, do you know Lu Majao? And I said, no, I don't. I would say irritatedly. And then one day, the name, this phrase clicked in my head. And I said, listen, who on earth are you talking about? And why should I know this person? He said, oh, he's a great musician, man. He plays a thing. And then the penny dropped. I said, are you talking about Lou? He's still alive? And they were talking about this guy when I was a kid, when I was a teenager, who used to play in this Shillong band called Great Society. And we used to make fun of him because he had the habit of wearing tight denim shirts in very, very cold weather. Shillong is quite cold, especially when I was growing up. But Lou insisted on going around wearing his tight denim shorts, no matter how cold it was, like freezing. And Lou was Lou was like this sort of, Shillong was a very small town. In spite of all its riots, Lou was he was almost like an aging uncle, eccentric uncle. He wasn't that old, actually. He was maybe like 10 years older than me. But, when you're 14, everybody's kind of old, And Lou was this guy, who would play, who was like, when you're 14, we would go, there would be like the one rock concert on a perfect spring day in the year, and the entire town would sort of be out there. This is wonderful. And Lou would be there in his tight denim shorts playing Rolling Stone, and he would hump the mic. I'm sorry, but this is what he would do. And we would all cheer, we were like, this is the great thing. I said, 20 years later, I realized that this band has actually, because of the globalization, has started playing in Delhi. And Lu Majao has become this guy with long hair, this eccentric uncle figure from my youth, has become like this great star figure for a certain degree of Delhi youth. But it didn't last long. You don't hear their names anymore. I think that, again, it had to do with the economy. Had a kind of, there was a lot of blues bands and clubs. Yeah. I think it began to collapse. But so in terms of the Northeast, that was the perception to a degree. But within that, the Northeast is a tremendously complicated place,
and
heterogeneous, and with incredible politics and art. It's very, very alive. That there's just no interest in. People just want to, they have no interest in that at all. And the Northeast is also its own space. It looks to Delhi and Bombay and the West only. For instance, South Korean operas are very, very popular in the Northeast. So the Northeast is in a different kind of, there's other kinds of globalization happening there as well. So,
Eastward.
Eastward, but also, and then, the Northeast is also violence because it's in the heart of climate change. There are dams that are being built all over the Brahmaputra, and there's massive sort of, wonderful sort of, peasant agitation, worker agitations. There's a very charismatic young mass. He's an essayist and a writer. He leads this mass leader. So there's a lot of turmoil. But in Delhi or Bombay or even Calcutta, people aren't aware of this. There's just this sort of, it's like an exotic place you go for adventure holidays, basically.
Okay. So I think we can now, thank you, Siddharth, but we can now take some questions from the audience. And how would you prefer to do it? Take a few questions and then respond, or?
Sure, that might be more better in terms of time.
Yeah.
And I would love questions about writing, by the way. I know we've talked mostly about, and I think partly with the nonfiction book, but I would love to talk about more aesthetic questions as well. That's also important.
In that case, I'd like to ask you about what you see the role of the writer in the new India. In terms of, for example, speaking truth to power in the past, the problems with censorship. Now you face a different kind of censorship where you've got extremely wealthy people that can employ legal mechanisms to keep writers silent. So I'm thinking, what do you see the role of the writer? I mean, some writers have just decided to leave India behind and hang out with you too. And, others like Arundhati Roy become even more politically engaged to the point where almost they stop writing fiction. So, I'd be interested to hear your thoughts.
Well, I spent a great deal of time with Arundhati in July. I was interviewing her for a magazine piece I'm doing. And I was traveling in Kashmir with her, actually. So that's interesting that you bring that up. But, I think on the one hand, writing has become a career in a very, very big way in India. And it's a bigger market. There is this new middle class. So there are writers.
There are all these literary festivals.
There are all the literary festivals, and there are all the malls. There's a kind of, there are writers who write for, who are writing for the new emerging middle classes. It very much panders to nationalism, to their sense of nationalism. It's very, very, they often come from backgrounds like banking or marketing. And they use Hindu sort of majoritarian symbols. And this is one kind of Indian writing which has to be taken into account. Another kind of Indian writing is more liberal, in its views, but is also ultimately about the elites, essentially. It's really unable to engage with, they're unable to engage with what's happening. I don't even want to say outside the cities, because even the cities are actually quite complex spaces, as you very well know. Cities are also like worlds within them. They are many worlds within themselves. But so you have that. Having said that, I will say that Arundhati, or there are writers. I can even think of a very young writer from the Northeast. There's a whole bunch of them, or from Kashmir. Often people maybe who've experienced some level of marginality, whether it's because of gender, whether it's because of ethnicity, whether it's because of where they grew up, whether it's because they were interested in these questions. So there is a certain Indian writing that's actually quite interesting. But it's not the one that often comes up, that's visible. It's not the one that's feted at the literary festivals, for instance. Mm-hmm. The literary festivals are more, I think, I don't think it's an accident that they happen in places like Jaipur or Goa or Kerala. It's like, you listen to a book, but you also have a nice holiday. Mm-hmm. I always joke about, you also get, you get a nice little holiday. And literature is almost a kind of, the novel is almost like an accessory to the nice sort of vacation, basically. I am critical of that a little bit, but there is a lot of very interesting writing happening in various languages. It's much more vibrant than you would think is the case if you just follow it from a distance or from the festivals or just the few circles in the cities. But when I say the cities, I mean particular places, because even in the cities, there are little magazines. There's a lot of writing in languages. There's a lot of translations, actually. For instance, Roy gets translated quite rapidly into various other Indian languages. I met this, so it's very vibrant underneath that sort of glossy sort of layer. But there it seems very similar and apolitical, or sometimes actually quite conservative in its politics.
Yeah.
So actually, just to anecdote, at the Goa Literary Festival, they did have a whole section on Kashmiri literature last year, and they actually did talk about these political issues. So maybe there's a mix of both that. I'm interested. You mentioned Roy, and then you mentioned the protests around the rape case, and then you mentioned that there are certain things that people will protest about and not others. I'm just curious if you could talk a little bit about cultures of protest, new cultures of protest in the new India, whether it's middle class protests on the Hazara or other ways in which protest has changed. Like, are there still the similar kind of action idioms for protest that we had before neoliberalism, with peasant or union protests, and how does that change?
Well, I would say yes. I mean, if you look at, for instance, if you look at Assam, I mean, there's a or if you look at, if you look at, say, certain sites that are coming up, like nuclear reactors, if you look at dams, there are massive protests that happen, and to a degree they are traditional in the sense of, dharnas, the whole lexicon of Indian protest, the chakka jams and the dharnas, and people do use cell phones to communicate with each other, absolutely. What has happened though is that the media coverage has completely ceased, it's completely blanked out. And the Indian media is very, especially urban English language media, is very particularly virulent. Now, so that's one thing that's happening. It depends on where. It's not, I mean, again, you mentioned the Kashmir panel. I'm sure some of my friends were there in the writer. But one of the interesting things was that there was this attempt to hold a literary festival in Kashmir. And most of the writers that I know, Mirza Wahid, Basharat Pir, they all backed out of it because there were these very strong, it was going to be held at this Delhi public school, which has close connections with the army. And ultimately, it was cancelled. So, I think, there's so many of them happening now, but they often have corporate sponsors. So it's often, that's the other question that comes up. I think the most egregious one was a very, very small into urban terms, a festival in Chhattisgarh, where children were forced to actually come. And then one of the Hindi writers just absolutely exploded when he realized this was happening. But I think there's a big connection between power and the written word, the spoken word. In terms of protest, the Anna Hazare protests were interesting, but again, I have to explain to people what's happening. Basically, it brought together a large number of middle-class celebrity figures around the platform of corruption, that, India, the government is very corrupt. And there was basically a document that was produced, or there were many drafts that it went through, that essentially India needs something called a Jan Lokpal, which is like a sort of tribune who can basically call anybody, even politicians, to account to try them for corruption.
Outside the electoral
system. And it had this very, very, on the one hand, I think the outrage, is understandable that things run badly. At the same time, the outrage of the middle class are also great beneficiaries of the fact that things are run badly. The system is gamed all the time. I don't think the Indian middle class is unique in this, by the way. I think the system is gamed in many places, actually. So I think in terms of the middle class protests, there were these protests, there was this attempt to sort of take the public space. And essentially, it ultimately, I think, from what I understand, it fizzled out. It fizzled out because the government does tend to be much more harsh in the way it reacts to these public gatherings. But this is not, again, specific to India. If you look across from Occupy to, Istanbul, to Turkey, to India, policing is much more violent than it used to be. It's much more sophisticated in its strategies. Now, the odd thing is that if you look at Kashmir, it's flipped around. Like if you go to Srinagar now, there is no overt military presence. They don't have bunkers and machine guns at every corner because now the surveillance is done completely electronically. And so Srinagar, it actually can seem like completely peaceful, well, for 3 days in a row, and then something happens. But one of the things that happened in terms of public protests in India is that in 2008, 2009, 2010, when there were big protests in Kashmir, a lot of the young people were using Facebook and social media until the government figured out that we can use this. And now they don't, people don't want to use social media. They don't want to use the internet because they feel that this is where Snowden and the NSA, India was very quick to say that we are not going to let Snowden come in here. People in power in India have said, what's wrong with this? This is fine. If the US was spying on India, that's fine. They're like friends. That's okay for us to. So there's a kind of surveillance, mechanism that's happening, at least in places like Kashmir. So I don't know. I think protests, it's hard to say. It is happening. It's very, very uneven. But the media is, I mean, doesn't cover much of this. I don't know if that answers your question, but it's changing constantly.
I think Carol and then
Sorry.
Marilyn.
I've got writing.
Oh, good. Writing question. Excellent.
So I wondered if you would talk a little bit about your use or deployment of characters in nonfiction and fiction. And if there's a case, is there a sense in which figures like that your nonfiction work is a kind of research that gives you a sense of character development that will appear later in novels, or is there a way, so like will an Esther figure or a Dwar figure into the novel you're working on now? Or is there also a way in which your sort of novelist impulse or desire to construct narrative and story patterns, does that influence the way you organize the, as you call them, characters in this nonfiction?
Okay, that's a tough one. Any other writing questions while I think? Yes, please.
Yeah, this is like a related writing question. I was like interested in how you decided to like report the stories or the characters, and you also kind of decided to like include yourself in the story as opposed to maybe writing by like Catherine Booth, for example, who is like completely absent in her book. Behind Beautiful Drivers.
Yes. Well, in terms of, I actually detest writing about myself in nonfiction. I hugely enjoy using my life in fiction because, I twist things around. But in nonfiction, I've always been hesitant. This one, in this nonfiction book, I used myself a little bit, although I was very irritated when an agent early on referred to it as a memoir, because I think that I'm the least important and least interesting character in the book. My function is essentially I'm tying them together. I'm bringing the different characters together. I also had a lot of, the I was important to me because even though I was writing a nonfiction book, I didn't want it to be a journalist's book. Not because there's anything wrong with a journalist's book, but I didn't think that was my strength, or that's not what I wanted to do. I wanted it to be as scrupulously researched as possible, but almost like a nonfiction novel. Now, because I was going so much around different parts of the country and the characters don't really know each other. So in a novel, you can make the characters meet each other or collide with each other. Or sometimes, that wonderful, Virginia Woolf novel, Mrs. Dalloway, where, you have Clarissa sort of walking down and you have Septimus and they almost meet but don't quite. It's this wonderful, beautiful moment, but, it's this very tightly controlled space. Now, I do have moments like that in the book, but I had to be open. These things had to happen. Like, there's this moment where I'm with this engineer in his beautiful villa in Bangalore, and there's this newspaper which has the face of Arindam Chaudhary in it, and I absolutely use that. But I had to use myself. The I needed to have a history. The I needed to have a personality. I find it really hard now. I've become more critical as I've gone along to read travel books or journalist books. Typically, often it's a Western journalist who goes into some kind of space. And even when it's very well written, the narrator is finished going in writing about Patagonia or going in writing about India. There's nothing. They are complete. And only the people around them are incomplete. But for me, I am actually incomplete as well, which is why I react to some of the characters. I wanted to make my biases very clear. There's no pretense of objectivity. It's very clear whom I like more than others. Like, there's a moment like for Esther, for instance. I actually go to her house, which I don't do with, even when I go to the rich man engineer's villa, it's empty. It's not, nobody's moved in. I'm not intruding into the space of domesticity. And that I was doing it almost deliberately. Like, I don't write so much about Arindam Chaudhary's family because I felt that, even though there are bits that I felt it wouldn't be right to do so. But with Esther, she asked herself that, do you want to come and have lunch? And it was this completely different kind of interaction. And I've stayed in touch with her a little bit, actually, post. So I actually know her story beyond what's written in the book. But yeah, I wanted to use the I to connect these characters, to make it clear to the reader that this I has a history. And in a way, this narrator is as unfinished. I am not some distant observer watching people around me. but I am also somebody who's actually been affected by these processes unfolding around me. So that's one thing that I was trying to do deliberately, to some degree. In terms of coming back to fiction, I mean, I think in characters in fiction can't really sue you. That's kind of nice. And there was this moment where sitting in the offices of the British publisher and sitting with the lawyer, the Penguin lawyer, I remember this moment. I said, wait till I put him in a book, in a novel. And my editor's looking at me. She said, did you see how worried the lawyer looked? How worried she looked when he said that? Anyway, so, there's much more freedom, obviously, in what you can do with the characters in fiction. Obviously, there are many more ways to go wrong as well, because with more freedom comes also all these ways in which you can mess up. But I mean, if I was to talk about my own preferences, I do prefer the fictional characters because it's so much deeper that I can go with them. I can go inside their heads, and that's another reason for the narrator being there in the nonfiction book in a big way, because I don't do that thing of going into people's heads. The only person whose head the nonfiction book goes into is the narrator. And I can assure you, not everything. Only selected sort of, artifice. Control, absolutely. But in a novel, you can go into the heads of the characters. And as a writer, I'm so surprised by what I find. I mean, when you go inside the head of a fictional character, sometimes you're really shocked by what is actually there. I mean, there was nothing, it was not there in my mind consciously when I was going in. So I do prefer that, but maybe I'm saying that because I'm working on fiction at the moment.
Marilyn?
The question will grab everybody away, but I was just interested, we're talking about how much the way you're talking and reading sections of it, everything's turned towards the West. But I'm really curious, like, how does the figure of China figure in the rhetoric of India? Because especially a lot of this big break between the elites, that a lot of the kids who are now going to taking university or coming over to the States to come to the cities, their parents struggled from the village, the grandmother's still out in the village, but there's a real break and a real resentment. So it seems like, and a repressive government in some ways. So but it's interesting to think that does India just kind of stamp its back to China and looks towards the West, or tries to see itself, well, we're democratic and they're not. I'm just interested in how China figures rhetorically in conversation.
Oh, well, in the book, China is there, but just a section I talked about happened to be with the West, because I think Bhopal, the rhetoric was about, because it's about environmental disasters. So both, But one of the other, if you look at the characters in the book, which I did at a certain point, and how much they've traveled, it's interesting that the wealthy character is the only one who lives still in this, who's always been in Delhi. Otherwise, every single character that I map in the book, from the very migrant labor, they've all traveled somewhere, either within the borders or outside the borders. When they've traveled outside the borders, which is interesting, the engineering crowd the connection has been America. But if you look at the migrant workers in the book, they've often gone to the Middle East. The farmers, they've often gone to the Middle East. So the Middle East is a very, very big hub for the Indian imaginary as well. And so places like Dubai, this is the place where a poor farmer from Andhra goes and slaves in order to save enough money to buy a pump. Now in the Northeast, the China does figure as a big, the Northeast, but also Korea, as I mentioned. South Korea figures as a kind of it is kind of looking east. What does India say about China? Well, it depends upon which India. I mean, if you look at the Indian elites, they do like to demarcate themselves from China. They detest everything about China except its authoritarianism, which they admire. The Indian elites think everything about the Communist Party in China is wrong, except its authoritarianism. That's the only thing they would replicate if they could, because, look at our poor, it takes so much time to move them out, they just do it in a day. So that they would replicate if they could. None of the social justice, none of the health care. And, if you look at, again, there's been pretty good studies. If you look at the, some of the issues, in terms of health care, or, if you compare. None of the Indian elites want to replicate that. They love the idea that you can go and demolish a slum. That they deeply, deeply admire about China. That you can demolish a slum without thinking twice about it. But in other ways, I would say. So that's the elite. I think. And among the elite, there is also a great deal of identification with the United States and with the West, with the United States. And it's a very particular kind of United States. It's very Reagan Tea Party America. There's none of this nonsense of liberal democracy, and so none of this. This is the America they completely revere among the elites. But the elites are a small strand. I mean, ultimately, in terms of numbers. Is there a consciousness of China among? Yes, I think that there's very similar problems. For instance, if you look at environmental problems in India and China, are deeply, deeply similar. And there, among activists, among people, there's actually quite a bit of awareness. I mean, people who are talking about the dam in Brahmaputra, they know that there's a dam also being built on the other side of the border. It's the same river by China or by Three Gorges, or the incredible kind of pollution, or the forced urban migration. There is an awareness of these things among, again, once you go below the media, that elite layer, it's fairly sophisticated and it's fairly aware. And I think it's quite critical. I mean, ultimately, that the Chinese model of growth is also flawed and problematic.
Okay. Well, thank you all for coming, and thank you very much, Siddharth, for a wonderful reading, and I hope a stimulating exchange with the audience and everything. So, yes, thank you very much for coming.
Thank you.